Welcome to The Forgotten, a member of Episodic Network. Season 2, Episode 10, Between Two Stools. As I have announced, I will bring this season to an end until the end of this week, when I will leave for 2 weeks of vacation in British Columbia. For this episode, to describe the unfolding diplomatic events correctly and to give you a better insight into people's heads, I will rely heavily on quotes. I have never had as much fun while researching an episode, and I hope you enjoy the product of it. It's going to be quite the trip. It had been rough times for the ambassador of the United States to the court of St. James. The constant war threat loomed over Europe, and the father of 9 feared nothing more than America being dragged into a devastating conflict. At home, this attitude had brought him the reputation of a Nazi toady and a appeaser, which was, in certain circles, extremely unpopular. The left wing fiercely attacked him for his readiness to wholeheartedly embrace authoritarian regimes as worthy, equal diplomatic entities. The Jewish community resented his participation in the circles around Lord and Lady Esther, which were, at least according to Joe's biographer Richard J. Whalen, at least as anti-Semitic as him. And President Roosevelt both disliked his high demeanor towards the commander-in-chief, as well as his habit of not being too much of a public sympathizer of his ideas. In England itself, things were going moderately well. The appeasement party around Chamberlain had managed to convince the populace that the Munich Agreement was indeed a guarantee for peace in our time. Joe's eldest daughter, Kathleen, Kick, made the acquaintance of a charming young aristocrat, William Cavendish, heir to the Duchy of Devonshire. Joe Jr. had been sent to Prague following the treaty, communicating with the US Embassy there. After his short stay, he went on a mission his father strongly disapproved of. In late 1938, he went to Madrid, already under siege by Spanish nationalists. It was, of course, entirely possible for him to die under the terrible shelling and the general lack of food and supplies. According to his reports, he shared the meager rations of the ordinary Spanish populace. To correct a mistake made last episode, Jack left Harvard for a semester at the embassy in February 1939 and not, like his brother, in 1938. I want to shed some light on an interesting event that is often overlooked in popular history. On March 2nd, 1939, Eugenio Pacelli was crowned Pope Pius XII in Rome. Joe and his family, profound Catholics that they were, of course traveled to Rome. Actually, they had some history with the soon-to-be head of the Catholic Church. In 1936, the Apostolic Nuncio Pacelli had been visiting the United States to meet the President, and Joe Kennedy, back then still in the inner circle of the Roosevelt administration, had been picked to arrange it. The Nuncius had paid a visit to the Kennedy family home, and the sofa he had taken a seat upon was, as he was crowned Pontifex Maximus, engraved with a little plaque describing the illustrious event, and always went with the Kennedy family wherever they went. Indeed, the Pope would always regard the family highly. The only papal countess he would ever appoint was Rose Kennedy, and, according to Whalen, he gave the order of Pius IX to Joe, an honor usually reserved for heads of state. It says a lot about Joe's character that he was very well convinced that the Pope was going to stop Italy from going to war if Kennedy was going to ask him. He immediately sent a confidential letter to Sumner Welles, the Undersecretary of State and Foreign Relations Advisor to the President. There is no source on Welles' reaction to it, but I tend to believe that Welles, skilled diplomat he was, did not believe in this daydream for only 1 second. Of course, he was not only in Italy out of reasons of faith. During his stay in Rome, Joe met Count Galeazzo Ciano, the foreign minister of Italy. In a report to State Secretary Cordell Hull and the State Department, Joe wrote, "I also met Ciano. I do not know how capable he is in office, but I have never met a more pompous ass in my entire life. He spent most of his time rushing girls into a corner for conversation, and at dinner he would not talk seriously for 5 minutes for fear that 2 or 3 girls who were invited in order to get him to come might get out of sight. I came away with the belief that we could accomplish much more by sending a dozen chorus girls to Rome rather than a flock of diplomats and a fleet of airplanes." Contrary to the British opinion, Joe was convinced that the Italians did indeed want to avoid war. He was very well aware of the high esteem many common Italians held the US in, and how many of their relatives had emigrated to America to improve their lives over the last 50 years. Later the same month, it became apparent that Kennedy's, Chamberlain's, and all the appeasers' hopes for peace were in vain. Starting on March 15th, German and, as is seldomly mentioned, Polish and Hungarian forces occupied what remained of Czechoslovakia. While Germany, of course, got the vast majority of the territory, Poland occupied the Český Těšin, Hungary took a bunch of border regions which were settled by ethnic Hungarians, and as of March 23rd, Slovakia signed a treaty making it a satellite of the Reich. The British reaction was swift. On September 31st, the British government proclaimed a guarantee of Polish independence. While the Polish annexation of a part of Czechia raised some eyebrows and the country was not the ideal ideological partner, it was certain that Poland would be the next target of German expansionism. Shedding some light on Joe's opinion of the entire affair, Whalen mentions a 1945 conversation between Kennedy and the Secretary of the Navy James Forrest Toll, which the latter mentions in his diary. Played golf today with Joe Kennedy. Played golf today with Joe Kennedy. He said Chamberlain's position in 1938 was that England had nothing with which to fight and that she could not risk going to war with Hitler. Kennedy's view, that Hitler would have fought Russia without any later conflict with England if it had not been for Bullitt's urging to Roosevelt in the summer of 1939 that the Germans must be face down about Poland. Neither the French nor the British would have made Poland a cause of war if it had not been for the constant needling from Washington. Bullitt, he said, kept telling Roosevelt that the Germans would not fight, Kennedy that they would, and that they would overrun Europe. Chamberlain, he says, stated that America and the world Jews had forced England into war. In his telephone conversations with Roosevelt in the summer of 1939, the president kept telling him to put some iron up Chamberlain's backside. Kennedy's response always that putting iron up his backside did no good unless the British had some iron with which to fight, and they did not. The aforementioned William C. Bullitt, ambassador to France since August 1936 and an old stager in the diplomatic business, had, after being against any kind of war and US intervention, changed his mind in January 1939 and fiercely advocated a hard stance towards Germany, going so far as to assure the Polish ambassador in Paris that the US would support the Polish in any negotiations over Hitler's new fetish, the Danzig Corridor. So, after being on Kennedy's line for the first year of his ambassadorship, he had changed sides and earned his colleagues' scorn. Kennedy himself was, as can be read in both The Patriarch and The Founding Father, convinced that the next logical target of Germany after conquering Poland would be the Soviet Union, its ideological nemesis and, in his eyes, the great enemy of order and stability. Whether this might have been wishful thinking or actually reasonable, the guarantee of Poland made it highly unlikely that that would be the case. Kennedy quickly returned to his mantra of economic influence being the replacement for diplomatic prowess and advocated increased financial support for Britain and France. And he didn't stop there. In an earlier telegraph to Washington, he had stated that the German economy was in shambles. And indeed it was. As Germany finally started the war, there was a popular saying among German soldiers, "Nach dem ersten deutschen Tank kommt der Chef der Deutschen Bank," translating roughly into "after the first German tank comes the boss of the German bank," describing the terrible plundering of resources and anything worth something in Poland and any other state the Wehrmacht overran. Hitler had a massive economic problem. His costly infrastructure projects and rearmament expenditures caused something of an inflation crisis. The system of the MEFO exchanges, with which Germany disguised its massive arms expenditures, created a galloping inflation. So Kennedy was very much willing to stabilize the German economy with US investments. According to Nassau, this shows how much Kennedy still believed Hitler to be a rational actor who was, as most heads of government in the Western world were, mostly concerned with economic measures. Nassau writes, Kennedy continued to regard him as if he were a business leader with whom it was possible to negotiate one's differences. He continued to hold tight to the idea that Hitler's absorption of first Austria, then the Sudetenland, and now what remained of Czechoslovakia had been prompted by economic problems, and that Hitler would cease and desist from future aggression if and when the German economy was sound, foreign currency and gold reserves sufficient, and trade robust. He cabled Sumner Welles once again upon the issue to meet a German banker in Paris to discuss the details of this arrangement, as he of course had to ask for permission first. His contact in Paris, the president of General Motors Overseas, had unfortunately already set up the date. Welles and Hull promptly denied. Upon phoning the president himself, he denied it as well. The reason for the denial was that a sudden trip to Paris to meet a German banker would not result in positive press coverage, something Roosevelt, his re-election campaign in mind, was very wary of. Instead, Kennedy surpassed the veto by inviting the banker to London, something the press noticed, but did not dig deep enough into to see why a Nazi financier came to London. As you might imagine, the department and the president were furious. Soon enough, rumors about Kennedy's dismissal were spreading again back in the States. Even if Joe Kennedy and his switching attitudes toward facing down the Third Reich were most certainly not a sign that he knew perfectly well what he was doing, but he managed to perform a historic diplomatic stunt. In June, he persuaded King George VI and his wife to go on a state visit to the US. Well, actually, it was a state visit from Canada to the US. During the trip to Canada, they were supposed to visit the United States and meet Cordell Hull and the president in order to win public support for the British in the US, something that apparently worked just fine. George was the first British monarch to ever set a foot on American soil. Kennedy made up his mind that he wanted to resign after the state visit was conducted successfully, but, as had happened before, and would happen again, he was talked out of it by the president himself, who still did not want him to be in the US and could not afford to exchange the ambassador in such turbulent times. He told him that, if he still wanted to, he could resign in fall, something which the unfolding events would make impossible anyways. The state visit, however, brought him only scorn in the eyes of his apparent allies, the isolationists among the American editors and writers. A joke invented by the wife of Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes stated that Chamberlain has decided to increase his cabinet so he can give Joe Kennedy a place in it. It quickly found a way into the newspapers, especially because of his close friendship to Neville Chamberlain. Very much indeed, Joe had always been on one wavelength with the British Prime Minister. They shared the opinion that there really was nothing worth going to war for on the European continent, and that by diplomacy and giving Hitler what he wanted, peace could be ensured. Upon the sarcastic remark that history would remember Chamberlain as the worst Prime Minister Britain ever had, Kennedy replied, "I think it will remember him as the best." Returning from a trip to France that lasted for the first half of August 1939, the last vacation he would have in quite a while, Joe was met with the news that would finally tear up any hope for peace. On August 23rd, in Moscow, Joachim von Ribbentrop and Vyacheslav Molotov signed a Treaty of Non-Aggression, henceforth either known as the Hitler-Stalin Pact or the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, guaranteeing the neutrality of the USSR in any coming conflict, as well as good trade relations between the Soviet Empire and the National Socialist Reich. Kennedy was swift in his report to Washington. He urged the State Department on behest of the British to tell the Poles they were to cede Danzig if the Germans threatened to attack, something which the president, having informally assured diplomatic support to the Polish government, could not do. A State Department official who had nothing but scorn for Kennedy anyways, J. Moffat, commented that it merely meant that they, the Brits, wanted us to assume the responsibility of a new Munich and to do their dirty work for them. Bad news continued to hit Joe during the following week. Jack, who had one of his first embassy missions to Berlin, returned with a message from the US Chargé d'Affaires that war would break out in a week. Chamberlain, his hands being tied by the proclaimed guarantee, uttered towards Joe that they, the British, could not save the Poles. They can merely carry on a war of revenge that will mean the destruction of all Europe. Any further initiatives for peace were to no avail. On September 1st, 1939, German tanks crossed the border into Poland. War had begun. The British government and parliament feverishly sought a way out, but as the final ultimatum had gone unheeded, on September 3rd at 11 o'clock, the British were at war with Germany. Chamberlain, in the speech he would give to announce the state of war, said, "This is a sad day for all of us, and to none it is sadder than to me. Everything that I have worked for, everything that I have hoped for, everything that I have believed in during my public life has crashed into ruins. There is only one thing left for me to do. That is, to devote what strength and powers I have to forwarding the victory of the cause for which we have to sacrifice so much. I cannot tell what part I may be allowed to play myself. I trust I may live to see the day when Hitlerism has been destroyed and a liberated Europe has been re-established." He would not see this day. Receiving the news that war was now official, Joe Kennedy, of course, reported to Washington. As Richard J. Whalen writes, he put through a call to the White House. It was a few minutes after 4 a.m. in Washington when the telephone at the president's bedside rang and awakened him. His voice quavering, Kennedy recited to Roosevelt the substance of Chamberlain's speech. Then, almost overcome with despair, the ambassador said a new dark age was descending on Europe and predicted that the war, regardless of which side won, would only have one result: chaos. Urgent thoughts were raving through Roosevelt's mind, but he spent several moments trying unsuccessfully to steady Kennedy. The half-choked voice from London kept repeating, "It's the end of the world, the end of everything." World War II started with a bang for the United Kingdom. On September 4th at 1940 hours, German submarine U-30 torpedoed the transatlantic passenger ship SS Athenia close to the Hebrides. Among the over 1,400 passengers were 300 Americans. Fortunately, most of the passengers could be rescued, while the only lives lost were those in the explosion and 2 lifeboat accidents. Jack, being awakened by his father personally in the middle of the night, was being sent to Scotland, where the survivors were being brought. Upon meeting the haggard and exhausted people, JFK did a brilliant job appeasing, them and promising them that the US would do everything in their power to get them back stateside. Interestingly, both the State Department and the President remained relaxed about the war, at least irritatingly relaxed in the eyes of Kennedy, who was close to a breakdown. He was unnerved by the peacetime procedures in Washington while Great Britain was involved in a war between 3 major world powers. At least the war brought Kennedy back into a position of great importance. He was not sidelined and ignored by the State Department anymore. Back at home, the press now fashioned Kennedy into a wary observer of the war, as the Time magazine put it. He was very much aware of the possibility of a British defeat. The British armed forces were not prepared for a war of that magnitude. So, Joe conspired with the former appeaser circles, of course now heavily out of favor, to negotiate a separate peace between Germany and Britain after the pre-decided defeat of Poland. He offered himself as a middleman, and made the grave mistake of alluding to some of his British friends that the president might support it and negotiate peace. Hull cabled that, quote, "This government, so long as present European conditions continue, sees no opportunity nor occasion for any peace move to be initiated by the United States. The people of the United States would not support any move for peace initiated by this government that would consolidate or make possible a survival of the regime of force and aggression." On September 11th, Joe sent a direct message to the president, who later recalled, "Some weeks ago, Joe had tea with the king and queen, who were terribly disturbed by the situation. After his talks, Joe sat down and wrote the silliest message to me that I ever received. It urged me to do this, that, and the other thing in a frantic sort of way. It became apparent that the frantic actions to save the peace after it was too late already were not anywhere near successful. Indeed, they estranged Roosevelt from his ambassador even more than before, as apparently Roosevelt's hand in London had not only begun to think itself, but also to act upon those thoughts. The outbreak of the war had one big winner in British politics: Winston Churchill. He had been sidelined by the appeaser government for unequivocally warning everyone about the German threat. Now, to put it with Whalen, the shunned Cassandra wore prophet's mantle, and Chamberlain, in a desperate act to restore his popularity, made him First Lord of the Admiralty again, the same position he had when proposing and supervising the disastrous Gallipoli operation. Churchill had no respect for the ambassador. Being an aristocrat, but quintessentially a person of rather modest wealth, he disliked big finance and industry tycoons in general, probably because the majority of the Chamberlain cabinet consisted of them. He saw it as the right of the gentry to lead the Tories, not the right of some financiers. Furthermore, remembering Kennedy's reputation as an appeaser and friend of the Germans and his neglect for Churchill's opinions going as far back as 1935, both had a rather rough backstory. The biggest crux for Kennedy was that, starting September 11th, the same day as the president rejected Kennedy's proposal to negotiate peace, FDR wrote to Churchill, stating that he could always relay personal letters to him via the embassy. Churchill, of course, was very happy to do that, and the direct line between one of Kennedy's biggest and most skillful opponents and his boss was established. Over 1,700 letters had been exchanged between the president and Churchill up to the end of the war, all of which Churchill signed with naval person and, as he became prime minister, former naval person. This direct line would effectively hamper Kennedy's influence on the president's opinion, and we are not sure whether he was fully aware of it. We do not know whether he actually read the letters, whether he really cared about it, or whether he actively tried to sabotage the conversation. Whalen calls his position to and action upon the letters the biggest mystery in JPK's life. With the defeat of Poland on September 27th, the war entered into a calm phase, the Sitzkrieg. With hardly anything to do, all of his children except Rosemary, who we will shed some light upon later, and his wife preparing to leave the embattled country, and the general eerie calm in Britain, Joe turned to watching movies and reading a lot. Back home in the US, trouble did again brew. Since George Washington had stepped down from being re-elected a third time, no president ever ran for one. FDR, however, did not publicly say that he was going to honor this tradition. Indeed, inside his party, he had already lobbied for support of his third term, which was met with both great joy and utter disenchantment. So, being an important campaigner in both of Roosevelt's elections, Joe was of course asked about his opinion on the subject, especially given that he had been treated as a possible successor the year before. Giving an official press statement, he said, "The problems that are going to affect the people of the United States, political, social and economic, are already so great and becoming greater by the war that they should be handled by a man it won't take 2 years to educate. First and foremost, we know from what we have seen and heard that President Roosevelt's policy is to keep us out of the war. And war at this time would bring to this country chaos beyond anybody's dreams. This, in my opinion, overshadows any possible objection to a third term." Kennedy, by uttering this, again proved his uncanny ability to fall between two stools. While his friends in the Democratic Party, the more conservative elements, were sorely disappointed with his statement, the New Dealers and leftists did not really trust the ambassador to be true to his word. When he returned to the US for his traditional Palm Springs vacation during winter, which was extended up until February, creating rumors that he was not going to return to the UK at all, during the last month of this vacation, there was a new Kennedy for President search in Massachusetts. Amusingly, this happened without Kennedy's consent or knowledge, but the damage to his reputation was done, especially because Joe Jr. was, unlike his father, an avid supporter for FDR's strongest possible opponent in the party, Jim Farley. Another great mistake Joe made during his stay in the US was that he simply burst into an interview between Ambassador Bullitt, also at home for vacation, and correspondents of the Daily News. He apparently was not aware of the indecency of his intrusion and simply intervened into the interview, fiercely attacking the president so roughly that even Bullitt, an outspoken but modest critic of FDR, sprung up to defend him. Apparently, the two wranglers became so fierce in their argument that insults and slurs were dropped. Bullitt apparently called Joe disloyal, abysmally ignorant on foreign affairs, and that he hadn't any basis for expressing an opinion. Now, imagine you are the poor news guy sitting between the two schoolyard rowdies duking it out like this. The interviewers simply got up and left, and Bullitt relayed his version of the incident to Hull and Wells, who, at least we can imagine that, related to the president. All of this combined may have led Roosevelt to a drastic step. He was going to send Sumner Wells on a peace mission of his own without informing the embassy and without taking any embassy in Britain, Germany, Italy or France into the affair. Wells was going to act as a direct emissary of the president. I like to believe that the news of the squabbles between his ambassadors led FDR to undertake this measure, but it might as well have been Roosevelt's unnerving habit of creating several antagonistic offices and departments and then preside over their squabbles, as would happen later in the war. Unfortunately, the Axis states were not interested, and, even more embarrassing, only a few days after Welles's return, Germany invaded Scandinavia. The isolationist press, of course, rejoicing, prompting that it was American interference which prompted this step in an otherwise calm war. It became apparent from now on, Britain at war would need a united government of all parties. But when Chamberlain petitioned Clement Attlee, the head of the Labour Party, his proposal was turned down during the infamous Narvik debate. They simply refused to serve under him as Prime Minister. With a heavy heart and properly clenched teeth, he did what he had to do. On May 10th, he stepped down and handed over government to Winston Churchill, who was affirmed by the House of Commons and then promised the country and its citizens blood, toil, tears and sweat. Now the war was really on for the people of England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland and the Empire. The general calm phase of the war was definitely over when the Wehrmacht started Fall Gelb on May 10th. The so-called Westfeldzug, the Western Campaign, had begun. Now British troops would engage in massive, all-out battle with the Wehrmacht. On May 14th, facing the capitulation of Dutch forces, Kennedy sent the following report to Roosevelt. "I just left Churchill at 1 o'clock. He's sending you a message tomorrow morning saying he considers with the entrance of Italy, the chances of the Allies winning is slight. He said the German push is showing great power, and although the French are holding tonight, they are definitely worried. They are asking for more British troops at once, but Churchill is unwilling to send more from England at this time because he's convinced within a month England will be vigorously attacked. The reason for this message to you is that he needs help badly. I asked him what the United States could do to help that would not leave the United States holding the bag for a war in which the Allies expected to be beaten. It seems to me that if we had to fight to protect our lives, we would do better fighting in our own backyard. I said, you know our strength. What could we do if we wanted to help you all we can? You don't need money or credit now. The bulk of our navy is in the Pacific, and we have not enough airplanes for our own use, and our army is not up to requirements. So, if this is going to be a quick war all over in a few months, what could we do?" He said it was in his intention to ask for the loan of 30 or 40 of our old destroyers, and also whatever airplanes we could spare right now. He said, regardless of what Germany does to England and France, we'll never give up as long as he remains a power in public life, even if England is burned to the ground. Why, said he, the government will move to Canada and take the fleet and fight on. It however quickly became apparent that the Allied situation on the continent became untenable. As Joe foresaw, only a miracle could save the British forces in France. The only good news he received was that Jack, the terrible schoolboy, had graduated cum laude from Harvard and wrote a book, Why England Slept, a recollection of the British appeasement politics, which became critically acclaimed. With his father's help, it quickly sold more than 80,000 copies. In public, Joe affirmed his hard stance towards helping the British. In a newspaper interview from June 11th, he stated clearly that, "I told them they could expect zero help. We had none to offer, and I knew we couldn't give it, and, in the way of any material, we could not spare it." Unfortunately for his harsh stance, the Neutrality Act of 1939 clearly allowed Roosevelt to intervene with logistical help and trade with any embattled nations, of course heavily favoring the British and French for having command over the sea. I am pretty sure you're all waiting on a piece on the Destroyers for Braces agreement, but sadly Joe hardly played any role in it. Roosevelt personally dealt with Churchill and his staff, or delegated Hull and Welles to do so. Kennedy was completely sidelined during the entire negotiation, and he was, understandably, furious about it. In an angry, direct cable to the president, he wrote, "I've been fairly active in any enterprise which I have taken up for the last 25 years. Frankly and honestly, I do not enjoy being a dummy. I am very unhappy about the whole position, and of course there's always the alternative of resigning, which I would not hesitate to do if conditions were not as they are." Again, he was ignored. And he would be again. As Roosevelt sent Colonel Wild Bill Donovan to estimate the British chances of surviving a German invasion, something which Joe thought to be impossible, Kennedy was neither informed nor involved in the entire action. Donovan, who was also charged with forming the top-secret Office of Strategic Services in Britain, strongly supported the thesis that Britain could fend off a German invasion, and, in this regard, the word of a Medal of Honor recipient meant more to the president than that of his defeatist ambassador. According to David Nassau, the president was rather amused than distressed by Joe's protest and simply remarked, "Somebody's nose seems to be out of joint." His relation to Roosevelt was further strained when Joe Jr. started a serious campaign to gain a seat at the DNC from 15th to 18th July 1940, and he actually managed to be a delegate for Massachusetts. Upon asked by old party friends whether he could talk some sense into his son and make him support Roosevelt's third election campaign, Kennedy simply responded, "No, I would not think of telling him what to do." The DNC, however, became a massive success for Roosevelt and looked more like a Nazi rally than the place of a serious debate. There were flaming speeches for Roosevelt, as well as signs, hymn singing, and chants of "The party wants Roosevelt." Following a spy drama about an embassy worker, a subject which I will enunciate upon in a blog post on my website, theforgottenpodcast.wordpress.com, when I am in Canada, because I feel it might be too much information in this episode, direct communication between FDR and Churchill ceased for a few weeks in July, an opportunity for Kennedy to regain some status. Unfortunately, this was not the case. He was very much caught up in writing analyses of the general British situation, in which he often differentiated three classes of British people: soldiers, workers, and intelligent people. And all of those remarks were founded on the fear of a communist putsch, another nightmare he had. All of this was quickly put to rest when on September 7th, the first major air raid on London took place. The Blitz had begun. Let me make one point perfectly clear. Whatever you may read on some dubious websites about him fleeing London as soon as he could, it probably isn't true. According to all, even the most critic of his biographers, it was hardly fear that caused him to leave London for several times for the weekend, but rather boredom. Kennedy's advice was seldom heeded in Washington, and at his estate outside the city, he found pleasure in conversation with British aristocrats who had indeed fled from London, watching movies and wandering the countryside. When in London, he actively inspected bomb craters and even got into a hail of bombs that overturned his car, which he, miraculously, survived unhurt. An anecdote he and several others told later was that, upon inspecting more bomb damages, they found a bomb fragment with the letters JPK on it. Upon told this, he simply uttered, "Initials don't count," and continued the inspection. While all of this sounds badass, it nonetheless stressed his nerves. His discussions with Charles Lindbergh in 1938 and the tales told of Rotterdam and Warsaw made him fear the Luftwaffe more than anything else, and he was not shy to express it. While he admired the British people's stubbornness in taking the hits the Luftwaffe inflicted upon him, he nonetheless was disgusted by the self-congratulating rhetoric Churchill employed to rally the British. As he was well aware of the toll the submarine warfare took on Britain, he was convinced it would be starved out soon. In the US, the campaign of Roosevelt versus Wilkie was the most heated one so far, especially about the matter of neutrality. Roosevelt still publicly announced that he was the candidate of the neutrality supporters, yet it was more and more apparent in his rhetoric and in his initiative on the Neutrality Act in 1939 that he did not intend to let Germany win the war. Kennedy, who was again sidelined from the debate, was well aware of that, but kept his mouth shut in order not to hurt the party. In October 1940, he finally had it, with all of it. The State Department, in his eyes, was completely indifferent to his memoranda and messages, and did not even relay some of them to the President. And even the President himself, who he had considered a close friend upon leaving Washington in 1938, had obviously turned against him, something he refused to accept any guilt for. The press, of which he was the darling in 1938, treated him with contempt. In the eyes of many, his biographers and contemporaries, his position had become untenable way earlier, and only the President's personal intervention had kept him from packing his bags and leaving London. This time it would be different. On October 16th, he sent a telegram to the State Department. He threatened to publish a memorandum of his own views of the entire situation, diplomatic, political, economic, and electoral, if he was not allowed to leave the country a week later. Even if the President and State Department were not to allow it, he would have it published and leave anyways. This permission was important, for if he left without it, his foes at home and in England would accuse him of fleeing the Blitz. He got the permission and on 23rd of October 1940 entered a plane to Lisbon, where he boarded a ship to New York. He did not leave, however, without saying the final goodbye to a close friend. Neville Chamberlain had been visiting his doctor, complaining about abdominal pain in July 1940. The doctors found the source, terminal colon cancer, yet they did not tell him. On the week before he left, Joe visited his friend, and on the 22nd he wrote him a letter. "Before I must go, I must tell you what I feel in my heart about you. Your conception of what the world must do in order to be a fit place to live in is the last sensible thing we shall see before the pall of anarchy falls on us all. We have retired, but mark my words, the world will yet see that your struggle was never in vain. My job from now on is to tell the world of your hopes. Signed, now and forever your devoted friend, Joe Kennedy." Chamberlain succumbed to his illness on November 9th. He had served in London for 2 years and 9 months. Roosevelt firmly denied that Kennedy came home to resign. The press did not believe him for a second. Back at home, the first thing for him was meeting FDR. Roosevelt knew what was coming for him when Kennedy, upon asked to give a radio speech endorsing the candidate, firmly declined, stating that he did not have it in his heart. Once Kennedy and Roosevelt met, Whalen notes, quote, "Kennedy needed no prompting and proceeded to unburden himself, using, as Senator Burns dryly noted afterward, many words not found in dictionaries. He denounced the State Department in blistering language, citing chapter and verse of the shabby treatment he had received. Especially galling, he said, were the special envoys such as Wells and Donovan, who came to London to negotiate over his head. He complained of being ignored and kept on the shelf, uninformed on vital matters." Roosevelt, however, had a trick up his sleeve. Instead of saying anything in defense of the department, he wholeheartedly agreed, and emptied another bucket over the deskman, as he put it. Kennedy was baffled, and sufficiently appeased. His ego was satisfied, as he believed the highest authority of the country to be on his side. He then agreed to give the endorsement speech. In this speech, which was aired across the country, Joe defended President Roosevelt against any charge of wanting to join the war, and confirmed that there had been no agreement between the US and Great Britain that America was to join the war at any point. He ended the speech with the statement, "My wife and I have given 9 hostages to fortune. Our children and your children are more important than anything else in this world. The kind of America that they and their children will inherit is of grave concern to us all. In the light of these considerations, I believe that Franklin D. Roosevelt should be re-elected President of the United States." On November 5th, Roosevelt was re-elected. His third time, however, was won by the smallest margin since 1916, a clear sign that many distrusted the president's stance on neutrality. Only days after the speech, Joe was approached by the fiercely nationalist and neutralist America First Committee, and you say history doesn't repeat itself, to be its chairman, which he denied, nonetheless promising them his support. Back in the American upper class, he often chatted about his views, especially on Jews, which he now even more firmly accused of wanting the US to join the war. He formally resigned as an ambassador on December 1st, 1940, not without submitting a formal complaint about the State Department, which, as you might expect, largely had no effect. In January 1941, Roosevelt was tasked with giving a radio address to the discussion about the Lend-Lease Act, which had recently been brought into Congress. This radio address is, in my eyes, the final nail to the coffin of his political career. In it, he continuously contradicts himself upon his view of joining the war, and only mentioned Lend-Lease in the very end of it. In the 5 hours the address took, he rejected being called a defeatist, expressed his disgust with the possibility of American boys dying for Europe, and put special emphasis on a central problem of joining the war. He said, "It is said that we cannot exist in a world where totalitarianism rules. I grant you, it is a terrible future to contemplate. But why should anyone think that our getting into the war would preserve our ideals? A war which would then, practically, leave Russia alone outside the war area, getting stronger while the rest of the world approaches exhaustion. Well, at the end of the war, we win. So what? What is the status of the world? Who is going to reorganize Europe? To keep defeated Germany and the other countries from going completely communistic, We will have to reorganize them as well as ourselves, probably standing guard while this reorganization is taking place. I shudder to contemplate it. Are our children's and our grandchildren's lives to be spent standing guard in Europe while heaven knows what happens in America? At the end of his speech, he mentioned his distrust in the lend-lease law. He feared that giving the president too much authority might drag the country into the war. He's supposed to have Congress have the final say about the purchases of the other nations. The problem was that nobody knew who Kennedy had supported. By not taking one firm position, Kennedy had once again fallen between two stools. He was not isolationist enough for the America First Committee and not actively supporting the president enough to win back his trust. And the days afterward, he messed up even more by relativizing some of the points he made, which confused both sides even more. It was, finally, the straw that broke the camel's back. Columnist Dorothy Thompson of the New York Herald Tribune wrote that Kennedy had out-Hamleted Hamlet. Instead of posing the question to be or not to be, he managed to make it to be and not to be. Over the course of the next 4 years, he would not really appear in the public eye anymore. But more on this on the next episode. I want to close this episode by talking about a point of large interest, both in the public eye as well as in the eye of the listeners of this podcast. Hardly any topic seems to concern listeners and friends I tell about my podcast as much as Kennedy's treatment of his daughter Rosemary. Before going into what Wayland and Nassau both describe as Kennedy's patriarchy next episode, I deem it very necessary to cover this topic. When Rosemary and her family came to London, it appeared that this change of scene suited her very well. Her diaries show that she was very much in love with things other girls her age were enamored to. The opera, dresses, male acquaintances, and everything else you'd expect. She seemed to be a lively character, very outgoing, and in general a bliss to be around. If you compare that to what we have heard over the course of this podcast, it sounds as if she became a completely different person. Yet her intellectual disabilities still persisted, a secret which she herself and her parents guarded very well. Her gorgeous appearance still made her the darling of the boulevard press, something that took a toll on her nerves and mental stability. During the beginning of the Blitz, remember that she stayed behind with her father as the only relative. He sent her to a Montessori school in the countryside at Belmont. Her father's withdrawal from the service as the ambassador meant that she accompanied him back to the US. From then on, her life took a turn for the worse. Both Eunice and Rose Kennedy recalled a dramatic change of character. According to The Kennedys, an American drama by Collier and Horowitz, Rosemary became highly irritable. She even, for no apparent reason, attacked her mother's father, the venerable Honey Fitz, 78 years old at this point, you might remember from the first episodes, and, being brought into St. Gertrude's, a convent near Philadelphia, her situation became worse by the day. Her mental capabilities degraded again. She became more and more aggressive and violent. Kennedy, who from Rosemary's late first words had taken the full responsibility for the child from her mother's hands, made a difficult decision in fall of 1941. He consulted Dr. Walter Freeman, one of the leading neurologists in the United States. Freeman was an outspoken advocate of lobotomization, a process which aims at cutting brain tissue at the frontal lobe, what is basically a tube with a knife on it, entering through the eye cavity. He promised Joe that such a procedure would cure Rosemary's irritable, violent behavior and emotional distress, and that there was a 63% chance that Rosemary's intellect would improve, which is, from today's standpoint, absolutely nuts. Joe Kennedy decided to take the gamble. Dr. Freeman's account of the surgery can be found in Ronald Kessler's extremely critical The Sins of the Father. We went through the top of the head. I think Rosemary was awake. She had a mild tranquilizer. I made a surgical incision in the brain through the skull. It was near the front. It was on both sides. We just made a small incision, not more than an inch. The instrument Dr. Watts used looked like a butter knife. He swung it up and down to cut brain tissue. We put an instrument inside, he said. As Dr. Watts cut, Dr. Freeman asked Rosemary some questions. For example, he asked her to recite the Lord's Prayer, or sing God Bless America, or count backward. We made an estimate on how far to cut based on how she responded. When Rosemary began to become incoherent, they stopped. According to the same book, before the operation, Rosemary was fond of writing letters, although they had terrible spelling, dancing, and, surprisingly, quite a whiz at mathematics. After the operation, she could not speak anymore, could not walk, was incontinent, and was not able to perform the most simple of tasks. Her personality and all of her drives were completely extinguished. Joe's reaction to this circumstance shows a really abysmal trait of his. According to Nassau, he only mentioned her once in correspondence for the rest of his life, in a letter to his sister at St. Coletta's Convent in Jefferson, Wisconsin, where he hid her away from the rest of the world, even from his own family, even from her mother. He wrote that the solution of Rosemary's problem has been a major factor in the ability of all Kennedys to go about their life's work and to try and do as well as they can. According to Kessler, Rosemary became a non-person. When asked about her, he told everyone that she was a teacher for mentally retarded children. After going through the chapter about her lobotomy in The Sins of the Father again, it is apparently not even clear whether she was retarded after all. Dr. Bertram Brown, former director of the National Institute of Mental Health, pictured her, according from her mental abilities, to have at least an IQ of about 90, 15 more than the common border at which doctors of the time spoke about mental retardation. But as Brown continues, in a family where he guessed the average IQ to be 130, in comparison, she looked less intelligent to her family and parents. Be that as it may, I am pretty sure everyone listening to this podcast will agree with me that this treatment of a human being, whatever its mental health be, and to an extent the entire family, reveals the darkest side of Joe's character. He was able to sacrifice even the people closest to him for the goal of keeping the family reputation and their possibilities intact. Something which does sound more like Medici or Borgia than 20th century America. Next time, we will bring the series to an end. I intend to summarize Joe's involvement in the JFK career, his dealing with the many catastrophes that befell the Kennedy family, and his terrible end. Furthermore, I do not want to end this season without having a talk about the different sources I used, something which may help you take a different view on my statements. I wish you a good day or a good night. See you next time.